Okay, this is the second set of notes for this unit. A couple of reminders to you before we get started. Um, just make sure that you are filling in the handout as we go. There should be some diagrams that don't have labels that you should add labels to. Also, remember that you should be doing audio to get to write down anything else that isn't on the slide but is important to add to your notes. I know in the last video there was an issue with captioning, so sorry about that. Sometimes YouTube doesn't recognize some of the words that are being used. If that should happen this time around as well, unfortunately I don't know until after I've uploaded the video. If that should happen, then just let me know. If you do have any questions, feel free to pause, and I can always clarify something for you. But as long as you have headphones, you should be okay. All right, so let's get started. So we're talking about roundworms today, and they're from the phylum Nematoda, also known as nematodes. And roundworms are the most numerous, actually, of all animals. If we think about them in terms of the number of individuals, then nematodes actually do outnumber all animals, and they range in sizes, a wide range actually, from microscopic, very small ones to sometimes even a meter in length. And they are found, most species of roundworms are the free living kinds. So when I say free living, I mean that they're not parasites that have to live inside a host. They inhabit a wide range of environments, from soil to aquatic and so on, and temperatures as well, polar to tropic regions. There are, however, a number of them that are parasitic that we're actually going to talk about 4 or 5 of them today, and live in their hosts. Okay, in terms of main characteristics for roundworms, I'm going to point out 3 main characteristics. So one, they are unsegmented worms, and what that means, unsegmented, means that their body is in one solid piece. So you can see it's nice and smooth. If you've ever looked at like an earthworm is an example of a segmented worm. In fact, the next set of notes actually goes over them in more detail. But a segmented worm it almost looks like rings that make up their body. And as you can see with roundworms, they don't have those rings, so they're considered unsegmented. They have pseudocoeloms. That's the second characteristic. We'll talk about what a pseudocoelom is in a second. And then third, they have a digestive system that has 2 openings, a mouth end, like you can see here, and an anus end. And we'll talk about how that's important on a later slide also. Okay, so I already explained the unsegmented worms characteristic. Let's talk about pseudocoeloms. In order to explain what a pseudocoelom is, I want to refer you back to the different germ layers that we see with all organisms. So remember, there's usually an ectoderm, which is the outermost layer, what we see in light blue. Then there is a mesoderm, which is that middle layer. And then usually there is an endoderm, which we see in yellow here, that forms, in this case, the wall of the digestive tract. So what a pseudocoelom is actually a gap or a cavity, an empty space between the mesoderm and the endoderm. Okay, pseudo means false, so that's kind of like, it's like a false cavity. For the most part, just think of this as a body cavity. Okay, it's not completely empty, it's actually filled with a fluid. And we'll talk about what that fluid does on a later slide. But this becomes basically a cavity where organs are going to be housed. We have something similar to it as well. Our body organs, like our digestive or reproductive or respiratory organs, they're not directly attached to the muscles of our body or the skeleton. In fact, these organs are housed inside of a body cavity, and that's kind of what the pseudocoelom does. It provides like an empty space where organs can be housed, and the organ in this case is the digestive tract. Okay, the third characteristic I mentioned was that roundworms have a digestive tract with 2 openings. And I want to refer you back to if you think back to flatworms, they only have one opening for their digestive tract. So food goes in through the mouth, gets, kind of randomly moves around inside the flatworm, gets digested. Whatever doesn't get digested comes out the same entrance way. Not the best system. It's not very efficient. This system, however, is much more efficient. If you imagine, it basically just creates a one direction pathway. Food has to come in through the mouth, has to travel down the entire length, and then has to come out the other end. And so, kind of like if you think of a conveyor belt, it's the same thing. It creates a much more efficient system. Now the food actually has only one pathway it's going to go and get processed as much as possible, nutrients get absorbed as much as possible, and pretty much anything that doesn't get digested is going to end up coming out the other side. So it ends up being a much more efficient, better system for processing food. Okay, let's talk about a few of the major life functions that roundworms perform. Okay, so roundworms have specialized tissues, just like all organisms, so tissues that perform special functions. They have organ systems that carry out major life functions. I should mention, for the most part, the free-living roundworms are more complex than the parasitic ones. Free-living roundworms don't live in a host and rely on the host for nutrients, so they would need to have their own way of digesting food and so on. So they're going to be more complex inside them. I should point that out. Okay, so in terms of feeding, roundworms, many roundworms, free-living ones, have specialized mouth parts or spines, like you can see here, that are going to be used to catch and eat small animals. Okay, so that's something unique to roundworms if we compare them to, let's say, flatworms. Okay, in terms of respiration, circulation, and excretion, technically they are very similar to how flatworms are, in that they don't really have organ systems for these processes. Roundworms actually can do the same as flatworms, where they exchange gases and waste through their body walls. They depend on diffusion, that process of either oxygen or carbon dioxide or nutrients to just pass through the cell membranes to get from the outside to the inside. Okay, so that's not really any different from how flatworms are. Roundworms are still pretty simple when it comes to these processes. Oh, I should also mention, I know it's not on this slide or the next one, but I should also mention that's the same when it comes to the nervous system. So response to the environment. Roundworms are very similar to flatworms. They don't really have a brain, but they do have several nerves, ganglia, that are clustered together to act very similar to a brain. So they control the movement of the body. They do sense the environment so that the roundworm can respond to the environment. That includes being able to sense chemicals given off by prey or hosts to help them with finding food. But otherwise, they're very similar, even in their nervous system, to flatworms. Okay, in terms of movement, however, roundworms do have something a little bit different than flatworms. So remember the pseudocoelom I talked about before, that body cavity that's not empty but filled with a fluid. Well, that fluid, along with the muscles in the walls of the roundworm, together are responsible for movement. So that fluid actually acts almost like a skeleton, but a liquid skeleton, what we call a hydrostatic skeleton. And so the fluid, along with the muscles, ends up causing so it'll cause movement for that roundworm. And so if you've ever seen a snake moving through water or an eel moving through water, that's the kind of movement that aquatic roundworms will produce using the hydrostatic skeleton. And then if you've ever seen like a worm kind of that's been dug out of the soil and kind of wriggles around? That movement is made possible by that hydrostatic skeleton. So soil dwelling roundworms are able to move around by kind of thrashing back and forth, and that's how the hydrostatic skeleton is used for them. Okay, in terms of reproduction, roundworms reproduce sexually. So they actually have, unlike flatworms, where a lot of flatworms are hermaphrodites, having both male and female reproductive organs. Roundworms most species have separate sexes. So there are definite males and definite females. Males only produce sperm, females only produce eggs. And fertilization is internal. So the male will deposit sperm inside the female's reproductive tract. So that is how it is when it comes to roundworms, and it's quite different than flatworms. I should mention, though, that parasitic roundworms do have the added complication. In addition to these, they also often have life cycles that involve 2 or 3 different hosts. So they might have they might have more than one individual that they would infect for different stages of their life cycle, or if they have a single host, there might be several organs involved in the process of their life cycle, and we'll see some examples of that today. Okay, this is the life cycle of a typical roundworm. This is actually the ascarid roundworm, and we're going to talk about that in more detail later. So I'm not going to go through this whole process, but I want to point out two different part of the life cycles for roundworms. So there's something called the infective stage and the diagnostic stage. So the infective stage, we have this symbol right here for it, and that is pretty much just the process, the part of the life cycle where either a fertilized egg, like you see with these, or an embryo, where there's like a larvae inside of the egg waiting to be hatched, is going to make its way into the host. So the way that happens might depend on the type of roundworm we're talking about, but the whole point is the egg or the embryo somehow makes it into the host, which in this case, in this example, is a human. The other phase, or the other stage, is the diagnostic stage with the symbol marked here. And so that happens inside the host. And that's where the female worm and the male worm as adults are going to reproduce sexually and make eggs. And then these eggs will find their way to leaving the host. And again, the method depends on the type of roundworm we're talking about. In this case, the eggs are leaving on the feces of the human, but different roundworms have different ways of getting their eggs to leave the host, and that would be considered the diagnostic stage. Okay, so unfortunately these notes have to take a bit of a downward turn. We're going to talk about parasitic roundworms. So unfortunately, most of the roundworms that we are familiar with, or the ones that we come in contact with most, happen to be the ones that can have parasitic relationships with us. Now we're going to talk about 4 types: trichinosis causing worms, called trichinella worms, filarial worms, ascarid worms, and hookworms. Now I should mention, just as a disclaimer, so I know some people might be going to lunch or might have just come back from lunch when you're seeing these notes. Keep in mind that a lot of these roundworms, the chances of you getting these worms are pretty slim. I'm not saying impossible, but they're pretty slim because a lot of times it has to do with things like sanitation and how easily human waste can get in contact with the food we eat or whatever the case may be. So it's not that it's impossible for us to get these, but it is very unlikely. If you should happen to see a bit of pink in your hamburger or whatever, that doesn't mean, oh my gosh, I'm going to get these diseases. That's not it at all. It is important to be careful when it comes to food, as always, but I'll mention those when they come up, but don't this is not meant to kind of freak you out and make you not want to eat food for the next week. That's not the point of this. So just keep that in mind. You're not like particularly vulnerable to any of these at all. Okay, so let's just go through them and I'll explain how they're different from one another, these different types of parasitic roundworms. Okay, so the first is called trichinosis. Trichinosis is what the host would get as a disease, but trichinosis is caused by the adult trichinella worm. And these worms live and mate inside the intestines of their hosts. Okay, so a female carrying fertilized eggs in the intestines of a host would burrow into the intestinal wall and release larvae. Okay, so these larvae, these baby worms, will make it through the bloodstream and eventually get into the organs, burrow into the organs and tissues of that host. Okay, and when they dig into the tissues of the host, when they find a spot where they're going to be, they basically turn into this dormant state, which is a cyst, and this cyst has a larva that kind of stays a larva indefinitely. And trichinosis is actually quite painful. This process of these cysts forming can be quite uncomfortable, cause a lot of pain for the individual. But yeah, these cysts are basically in dormant state, inactive. And the way that they become active is if that meat that contains those cysts gets eaten by another individual. So trichinella, this worm, will complete its life cycle when another animal will eat the muscle tissue that has these cysts inside of it. And here you can see a cyst actually embedded in the muscle tissue. There's the dormant larvae right there. Okay, so once eaten, the inactive larvae activate again in the intestines of the new host, and the cycle starts all over. And so for humans, what that equates to, a lot of times, unfortunately, pork tends to be the culprit. Don't ask me why. I'm to be honest, I'm not sure. I could look into it if you're curious about it. I'm not sure at the moment. But humans can get trichinosis by eating raw or uncompletely cooked pork for this very reason. You might find these cysts inside pig meat, pork, and then if that pork is not cooked properly to kill these dormant larvae, or those cysts aren't removed at all, then it's possible that these larvae can make their way into the intestines of the new host, and the whole process starts all over again. Okay, filarial worms. So filarial worms are these very thin thread-like worms that live in the lymphatic vessels and blood vessels of birds and mammals. And if you're not familiar with the lymphatic system, that's the system responsible for draining excess fluid from our body tissues. That fluid can build up and can cause problems. So the lymphatic system is responsible for draining that fluid away and getting it back into the bloodstream. So filarial worms tend to live in these blood vessels and lymphatic vessels and block them up. And well, if you block up a drainage system, then a backup can happen. And so it can cause something called elephantiasis, which you can see here is like a swelling of tissues, and it can get pretty severe. These are very severe cases, but to give you an idea, it's very uncomfortable, very unfortunate, causes a lot of tissue damage and pain. Now, the way that filarial worms are transmitted is actually by mosquitoes. And so what happens is a mosquito would bite an individual that has these filarial larvae in their bloodstream. Those larvae are tiny enough that they can get into the mosquito. When the mosquito goes and flies off and bites someone else, those filarial larvae can then leave the mosquito and go into the new host, and then that spreads the worms, and that continues the problem. Okay, the third example is ascarid worms. Now, Ascaris lumbricoides is a very serious parasite for humans. This is actually a very small one right here, but they can get quite big. Vertebrate animals in general, this can be a problem. And the reason why they're so serious is because they can completely choke and fill a small intestine in a very short period of time, and they absorb the digested food from that host. They basically compete for nutrients with the host that they're living in. The host will eat food expecting to be nourished, and instead these roundworms, these Ascaris worms, will eat the food, and the host never gets the nutrients. And so malnutrition can happen in a very short period of time. Okay, so in your textbook you have these next 5 slides on a single diagram. I don't remember the page number, sorry, but if you need it, just let me know and just pause and I can point you in the right direction. But I'm going to walk you through the life cycle of the Ascaris here. And so the way that it works is we'll just start at we'll just start with one here. So a human may ingest food or water that has Ascaris eggs. The way that water or food gets these eggs will show up. We'll find out at the end of this life cycle. But in any case, infection. So these Ascaris eggs enter the body system. These are already fertilized eggs. Okay, and these eggs will then travel down the esophagus, down the stomach, make their way to the intestines. And in the intestines, they'll develop into larvae, which are just baby Ascaris worms. Okay, these larvae then enter the blood vessels. So the way that they do that is they'll burrow through the walls of the intestines, and there are blood vessels feeding the intestines. And so these larvae will enter those blood vessels and make their way through the circulatory system and find their way to the lungs. And in the lungs, they end up in the lung tissue, and then this individual coughs up those larvae. So what you see in blue, those are like the respiratory airway passages. Okay, so those larvae will go through these passageways, get coughed up, and you can see that this, what we call the windpipe, actually connects to the esophagus. So these larvae get coughed up. It's not that they leave and then come back in again, but what will happen is these larvae get coughed up and then end up going down the other tube to the stomach and to the intestines. And here they go through the process of developing to adulthood. Okay, and they can actually fill up the host intestine and kind of cause that malnutrition by consuming all of the nutrients that this individual eats. They can even block the intestines in some cases, that it can cause death if left untreated. But yeah, these adults now in the intestines, will sexually reproduce, make eggs, and those eggs are then going to leave the host in the feces. Okay, and the problem can be quite severe if a number of factors are not taken care of. So one, the main problem is that is if the feces that contain the eggs can somehow, through whatever process, contaminate food that's going to be going into other individuals. That's kind of what causes this cycle to continue. So this unfortunately is a problem in places where where sanitation just isn't as well developed. So a lot of underdeveloped countries are going to have this problem, where it's very common for human waste to come in contact with, let's say, the same water that's going to be used to water crops or to wash with, right? So unfortunately, ascarids can be really bad in places where sanitation isn't so great. In fact, it causes malnutrition in more than 1 billion people worldwide, and so the main causes are the spreading by eating vegetables or other foods not washed properly, and so that's unfortunately that's a big problem for individuals that just don't have the resources like proper sanitation. Okay, I should mention, since all of these examples have been humans, I should mention there are some non-human examples, like heartworm is a good example when it comes to our pets. If you've ever had a pet that has heartworm or has gotten treatments for heartworm, that is a type of roundworm that's actually transmitted just like the filarial worms transmitted through mosquitoes. So a mosquito would bite an individual that has heartworm. The larvae get into the mosquito. That mosquito will then bite a healthy animal, and the larvae get into their bloodstream. The one thing different, though, is it's not always the intestines. In this case, heartworm is called that because the worms actually do congest the heart, and you can see the blood vessels here can get quite packed in with these worms that then prevent the heart from pumping properly, and that can be really dangerous if left untreated. It could be fatal. Okay, lastly, hookworms, and that should end these notes. So hookworms are a little bit different from the other roundworms we've been talking about in that part of their life is actually outside of the host. So here is a hookworm egg. Eggs actually hatch and develop in the soil. And I know this is just a drawing, but you can see the hookworms kind of in the soil there. And the way that they get into a host is, they're called hookworms because they have these hooks or tooth-like structures at their mouths, and they basically latch on to bare skin and burrow into the skin and get into the bloodstream that way. Okay, and hookworms then get into the bloodstream, travel through the bloodstream of their host to the lungs, similar to the Ascaris worms. They'll travel to the lungs, get coughed up, go down to the intestines, and actually right here, this is looking inside of the intestines of an individual. You can see the hookworms are actually in the wall there. And what they do is they actually suck the host's blood, and by doing so they cause weakness and poor growth. Okay, all right, and I believe that's it for the notes. Yes, all right, thanks.